Good evening, everybody. Sorry I couldn't be with you this evening, but I'm recording now, and it'll be like we're together. Wanted to start this evening on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and recognizing that the CABC has adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. It's important that we sort out our understanding of what that framework then means and what it looks like to apply that. I would say that this is one of the most important tools in our toolbox. It was one of the very clear asks from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it has been an indigenously led initiative since its very start. And so to demonstrate that we're listening and that we're interested in responding, I've seen over and over and over again is a profound witness to sort of our reliability in the long journey that building right relationships is. And so all the more important for us to understand what these principles are. And my hope is that in your journey over the long haul, even our generational journeys, that we would be utilizing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as our framework for that and as a touch point along the way. So let's run through a quick history of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, something that some of you may already know quite well, but I still think it's important for us to understand where this has come from, so that we understand the relational nature out of which it comes, and the relational responsibilities we have in then keeping it. I'm just going to share my screen. So where did the UN Declaration come from? Why are we having this conversation? Again, this is a bit of review for you all, but important to remember that it came from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action number 48, which stated, "We call upon the church parties to the settlement agreement and all other faith groups and interfaith social justice groups in Canada who have not already done so, to formally adopt and comply with the principles, norms, and standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation." So that was what was asked of us. And over again, I hear from Indigenous communities where there haven't been commitments by church groups who are seeking to work with the community. I hear them say, why would we work with them when we've already made certain requests and they haven't complied with that? They haven't heard us. So understanding that hearing and responding is critical. Came out of the TRC. Important for us to remember, again, just by way of review, that the TRC was not an act of churches or of the government saying, hey, we understand, we've come to understand that the legacy of residential schools is one of harm, and we would like to set that right by embarking on this this commission. It was instead the initiative of survivors themselves who won the largest class action lawsuit against the government and churches, the churches that ran the schools. And then the survivors took that settlement money and asked that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission be created in response, because their desire was that things would change for future generations, and that couldn't happen just with money being paid out, but required, in their minds, all of Canada to understand what had happened. And then they propose this, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for moving forward and for painting the picture of what right relationship can look like. So where did the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People come from? You'll also notice that I say that whole name, awkward though it is. Sometimes I will say the UN Declaration, as opposed to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Important piece from one of the Indigenous leaders who was a part of pushing for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to be accepted at the UN, was she said, please don't call it UNDRIP and remove us and erase us again. Make sure that Indigenous peoples continue to be a part of what you're talking about. And so having heard that and having committed to doing that to the best of my ability, that is my commitment, and it's part of why this will take longer in explaining. But that process was a 20-year process by the Indigenous Task Force of the United Nations. I hear from folks sometimes that this is a United Nations initiative and that they are not supportive of the United Nations, and so are not supportive of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or they're they are suspicious about the claims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples because it is a UN document. But it's important to know that it was Indigenous peoples themselves who asked for the task force, and through the work of the task force then brought that back to the United Nations. And it isn't just like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was not the initiative of government and churches, so also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was not the initiative of the United Nations, but the initiative of Indigenous peoples who had to fight hard to get it accepted. It didn't take 20 years to get developed. It took 20 years to get accepted, including a hunger strike that was enacted on the UN floor, where there were pieces of this policy that were being bandied about, and Indigenous people said, no, all of these pieces are essential for our survival and thriving. So that was a long and significant fight. And initially it was not adopted by Canada, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And all of those countries, all four of those countries, are settler colonial states, right? So they are places where colonization happened by Europeans in all of these cases, primarily coming and moving into the land. So different from colonization that happened other places where there was the extraction of resources, primarily in the case of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and the US. Settlers came and stayed. And that was how colonization was enacted in those spaces. And so it becomes more awkward to recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples, because the claims upon which we occupy these nation states is founded on some principles that run contrary to some of the principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So where is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples currently? Currently, it has been adopted by all nations. Now, it doesn't have the status whereby it is enforceable across nation states, but it is significant that it has been adopted by all nations. So I want to just take a couple of minutes for us to watch a video, and it will be just Indigenous peoples who are reading out a summarized version of the principles of the Declaration. And as you listen, I want to invite you to just sort of treat it like Lectio Divina, where you just let the words kind of flow over you and see what catches your attention, see what surprises you, or what seems to stand out, or what might raise questions for you. We're actually going to listen to it twice. And so the first time, if you can just listen for what feels highlighted, and the second time through, and I'll remind you of this, for what questions or wonderings are prompted for you.
Article 1, Human Rights and fundamental freedoms.
Article 2, equality.
Article 3, the right to self-determination.
Article 4, autonomie et autogouvernance.
Article 5, indigenous institutions, state participation.
Oh, Article 6, nationality.
Artículo 7, vida, seguridad, libre de violencia, protección contra genocidio.
Article 8, cultural integrity and prevention of cultural destruction.
Artículo 9, comunidades y naciones sin discriminación.
Article 10, free, prior, and informed consent prior to removal and relocation.
Article 11, cultural tradition and customs.
Article 12, spiritual and religious traditions, repatriation of remains.
Artículo 13. El propio idioma es fundamental para preservar la cultura. Se garantiza la participación en diversos procedimientos.
Article 14, education and our own culture and language.
Article 15, enseignement et information publique pour promouvoir la paix dans la société.
Article 16, media and cultural diversity.
Article 17, employment and labor, protection from exploitation for children.
Article 18, indigenous decision-making and institutions.
Artículo 19, consulta previa con el consentimiento libre, previo e informado.
Article 20, subsistence and development in economic activities.
Article 21, improvement of indigenous living standards and special measures.
Article 22, ensure protection for elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities.
Artículo 23. Determinar y administrar el derecho al desarrollo económico y social.
Article 24, traditional medicine and holistic protection of resources, progressive realization of physical and mental health.
Article 25, indigenous peoples have distinctive spiritual relationships with their territories and have responsibilities to future generations.
Artículo 26, derecho a la tierra y reconocimiento legal de los sistemas indígenas.
Article 27, due recognition of indigenous lands and resources through fair process based on participation.
Article 28, indigenous redress and restitutions for lands and resources.
Article 29, environment, conservation and protection, prevention of hazardous materials, restoring health impacted by such materials.
Article 30, no military activities on indigenous land.
Artículo 31, patrimonio cultural, propiedad tradicional y propiedad intelectual.
Article 32, determine, develop priorities and strategies for resource development.
Article 33, identité indigène et citoyenneté basée sur la coutume.
Article 34, indigenous legal structures and customary practices in accordance with human rights standards.
Artículo 35, determinar responsabilidad individual en comunidades indígenas.
Artículo 36, contacto y cooperación, mismo si dividido por frontera.
Article 37, recognition of treaty rights and observation of agreements.
Article 38, national measures for achievement of declaration articles.
Article 39, access to assistance from states and international cooperation.
Article 40, dispute resolution and remedies based on indigenous traditions and customs and international human rights law.
Article 41, full realization of rights through cooperation and assistance from UN system and intergovernmental organizations.
Artículo 42. Promoción y aplicación de los artículos de la Declaración a través de las agencias especializadas de Naciones Unidas y del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas.
Article 43. The rights in the Declaration are the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world.
Article 44, guarantee of gender equality.
Article 45. Nothing in the Declaration diminishes, extinguishes indigenous peoples' rights, now or in the future.
Article 46, respect for the UN Charter and promotion of principles of peace, justice, and human rights.
So go ahead and pause this video for a few minutes while you discuss two things. One, just what did you notice about the people represented there who were reading out the principles? And then secondly, just what stood out to you? What did you hear as you listened? All right, we're going to listen one more time through that. It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose. So as you listen this time, what questions come up? What wonderings do you have based on these principles?
Article 1, human rights and fundamental freedoms.
Article 2, equality.
Article 3, the right to self-determination.
Article 4, autonomie et autogouvernance.
Article 5, indigenous institutions, state participation.
Oh, Article 6, nationality.
Artículo 7, vida, seguridad, libre de violencia, protección contra genocidio.
Article 8, cultural integrity and prevention of cultural destruction.
Artículo 9. Comunidades y naciones sin discriminación.
Article 10, free, prior, and informed consent prior to removal and relocation.
Article 11, cultural tradition and customs.
Article 12, spiritual and religious traditions, repatriation of remains.
Artículo 13. El propio idioma es fundamental para preservar la cultura. Se garantiza la participación en diversos procedimientos.
Article 14, education and our own culture and language.
Article 15, enseignement et information publique pour promouvoir la paix dans la société.
Article 16, media and cultural diversity.
Article 17, employment and labor, protection from exploitation for children.
Article 18, indigenous decision-making and institutions.
Artículo 19, consulta previa con el consentimiento libre, previo e informado.
Article 20, subsistence and development in economic activities.
Article 21, improvement of indigenous living standards and special measures.
Article 22, ensure protection for elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities.
Artículo 23. Determinar y administrar el derecho al desarrollo económico y social.
Article 24, traditional medicine and holistic protection of resources, progressive realization of physical and mental health.
Article 25. Indigenous peoples have distinctive spiritual relationships with their territories and have responsibilities to future generations.
Artículo 26. Derecho a la tierra y reconocimiento legal de los sistemas indígenas.
Article 27. Due recognition of Indigenous lands and resources through fair process based on participation.
Article 28. Indigenous redress and restitutions for lands and resources.
Article 29, environment, conservation and protection, prevention of hazardous materials, restoring health impacted by such materials.
Article 30, no military activities on indigenous land.
Artículo 31, patrimonio cultural, propiedad tradicional y propiedad intelectual.
Article 32, determine, develop priorities and strategies for resource development.
Article 33, identité indigène et citoyenneté basée sur la coutume.
Article 34, indigenous legal structures and customary practices in accordance with human rights standards.
Artículo 35, determinar responsabilidad individual en comunidades indígenas.
Artículo 36, contacto y cooperación, mismo si dividido por frontera.
Article 37, recognition of treaty rights and observation of agreements.
Article 38, national measures for achievement of declaration articles.
Article 39, access to assistance from states and international cooperation.
Article 40, dispute resolution and remedies based on indigenous traditions and customs and international human rights law.
Article 41, full realization of rights through cooperation and assistance from UN system and intergovernmental organizations.
Artículo 42, promoción y aplicación de los artículos de la Declaración a través de las agencias especializadas de Naciones Unidas y del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas.
Article 43, the rights in the Declaration are the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of the indigenous peoples of the world.
Article 44, guarantee of gender equality.
Article 45, nothing in the Declaration diminishes, extinguishes indigenous peoples' rights, now or in the future.
Article 46, respect for the UN Charter and promotion of principles of peace, justice, and human rights.
So what wonderings came up? What did you notice this second time through? I'll have you pause discussion on that until after I've run through just a summary of some of the principles so that you can kind of catch some categories into which these principles fall. So basically there are 7 categories. One is the right to self-determination, that indigenous peoples as groups have the right to determine what happens for themselves. That's not something that should happen by any other body. Secondly, the right to participate in any decision-making that impacts them. So a road goes through, they should be able to be a part of participating in that decision-making after they've said yes to whether or not it goes through, but also the decision-making that happens along the way, that's a right to be protected. Thirdly, that they have a right to cultural and spiritual identity as they define it and not as defined by anyone else. The right to lands and resources. So I said there were 7, but 6 is what fits on the screen. So the rights to lands and then the rights to resources, both of those are critical. In some of the original agreements, some of the original treaty agreements, the numbered treaties in Canada, there were rights to lands given, but only to the depth of a plow, so 6 inches below. Anything found below 6 inches belonged still to the state. So it's part of why those have to be distinguished from one another. And then the right to free, prior, and informed consent. And I would say this is one of the most critical ones for churches to be aware of as we seek to partner with Indigenous communities, that we are upfront with the community about things that we're interested in doing or partnering on, and that we give them the space of that free, prior, and informed consent. I'll tell you a story about that a little bit later. And then finally, the right to be free from discrimination. So I'll let you pause now and actually go back into your discussions. You might want to write in the chat what things you noticed, or just call those things out. I think the group is small enough to simply go around the circle. So just a couple of principles here. I told you I'd tell you about free, prior, and informed consent. And here's one story about a church who had been for years doing backyard Bible studies and a summer VBS program on a local reserve. And as we were talking about what it meant to adhere to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I suggested that had they ever asked permission to be doing those things on the reserve. And they said, well, yeah, we've, asked the woman whose home we do this in, and she's agreed. And I said, but have we asked the community leaders? And in different communities, that needs to be different people. Sometimes it might be band council. Sometimes it might be traditional leaders. And those are all things to kind of discern along the way. But at any rate, they decided, okay, that's the right thing for us to do. And we went and they asked permission. And in this case, it was Chief and Council. And Chief and Council asked the group to leave the room, and they deliberated for a while, and then called the group back in and said, actually, we would like you to stop running these camps and backyard Bible studies. And the church was devastated. This was a key point of connection and of outreach for them. And they really struggled with whether or not this was actually the devil getting in there to thwart their intentions of seeing the gospel advanced in the community, and whether they needed to listen to this or if they needed to resist it. They decided to listen and to respect the no that had been given, and to trust God with what that meant. So a year later, the Chief and Council actually called the pastor of that church and said, we'd like to have a meeting with that same group of people who came in the initial contingent. So the group gathered again, and Chief and Council said, because you respected the no that we gave you, we would actually like to partner together in developing a more robust program. We'd like you to be involved in the development of some of our teenagers into leaders. And can we also have some other components that run in the summer? And so what ended up happening was something far more robust, far more in depth and far reaching into the community, and a real partnership, plus the blessing of the community in this group participating. That has ended up opening up a ton of other doors for them, but it required adhering to this sense of needing to hear the no and to respect that. So there's one story of the implementation of free, prior, and informed consent and partnership. I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll look at one more of the articles. So Article 7, which says that Indigenous peoples have the collective right to live in freedom, peace, and security as distinct peoples, shall not be subjected to any act of genocide or any other act of violence, including forcibly removing children of the group to another group. So that seems like a no-brainer. It also seems like something that maybe we wouldn't be directly impacted by as churches. We maybe press into that at another point in time, but this is a case where the church may be called to do advocacy work on behalf of Indigenous peoples where removal is happening. I don't know what your rates are like in the Maritimes, but in the West, the number of children in care is much disproportionate for Indigenous children as opposed to non-Indigenous. So a mother in an article on CBC from 2019, this quote, "I felt robbed," is what an Indigenous mother says as her baby was apprehended as she was in hospital having just given birth. There's now a so this statistic here on the screen, 57% of newborns taken into foster care in British Columbia, where I live, are Indigenous. 2% of the population in BC is Indigenous. So anytime we see disproportionate numbers from the percentage of the population, we know that there's a systemic problem that is at play here. There was in 2019 something called the birth alert that I personally have witnessed many times, where if an Indigenous woman who has any other children in care or who was in care herself at any point in time, so remember 60s scoop and ongoing foster care apprehensions of children who then grow up to be adults, then in any of those cases, a birth alert was put out, and a social worker was to show up and to interrogate the mother as to whether or not she could care for the child and take them home. As I said, as a pastor in the downtown east side of Vancouver, I witnessed this all the time, and often being a white face in the room changed the dynamic of that interview with the social worker. But imagine being a new mother, brand new mother, especially if you're on the younger side, and you've just given birth, and within an hour, a social worker is there quizzing you on how it is that you think you're going to be able to care for this child. I can't imagine that very many mothers would actually be able to navigate that without a great deal of self-doubt and just wondering if they're worthy and capable. So in cases like this, sometimes we become aware of something like the UN Declaration Principles, and then we start to notice in the news, oh, wow, that's kind of in violation of this particular thing. And then we become aware and involved in different ways. So if this were your community and you were aware of a mother or even just this dynamic that's at play, how could your community respond? How would your church respond? Are there ways of coming round? And I'd like you to explore 3 barriers that you would encounter to responding. Those might even be barriers within yourself, right? What questions come up? What barriers arise? We are not looking to solve this today, but to just kind of poke and kind of prod at some of these practices that happen in ongoing ways outside of our view. But if we're to change the dynamics, we have to disrupt the systems that continue to oppress Indigenous people. So how might we be being called and beckoned into this work of justice, and what might stand in the way of that calling? So go ahead and pause the video for a few minutes while you discuss those questions. I hope that was a lively conversation and continues to prompt more lively conversations. I want to leave you with just a couple of things. One is this question of why should churches be dancing to the rhythm of something like a human rights measurement. And it's interesting to me, Nicholas Wolterstorff is a theologian, a theologian and an ethicist. And one of the things that he argues is that there is really no case for human rights if you don't have some framework of humans being made in the image of God. If there's not some sense of bearing the divine image, then there's kind of no ground for human rights. And so there are many ways that we can think of human rights as being a construct of the secular state, but in fact, they come out of Christian understandings of the importance and the value of every human, something we haven't practiced across the board with Indigenous peoples in Canada as the church, and so something for us to recover in that way. And sometimes as well, we get a little nervous about some kinds of advocacy work that feel less familiar to us. So I want to draw on a Baptist leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that justice and the work of justice is love with flesh on. And I think that's very true, and it rings true throughout the biblical narrative of where and how justice and a call to justice show up, and the ways in which Jesus embodies justice, particularly, and where to follow him in that. And so, so I want to just encourage us to be thinking about the call to be love made manifest. That results in justice. So again, I apologize for not being with you in real time tonight, but I do look forward as we get closer to being in person together at the beginning of November. Bless you all, and I look forward to fielding any questions and any hot topics that came up in this time when we're together, or feel free to shoot me an email or Laura as well. Thanks again.